Going to try something a little bit different today. We are chatting with Joe Casabona. He's a podcast system coach at podcastworkflows.com, and he's all into how automation and software solutions can help you with your podcast. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
We are excited to have you. So before we jump into your, system workflows and automation and whatnot, how did you arrive in the podcasting space?
Well, I originally arrived in the podcasting space around 2010, something like that. I was hanging out with a bunch of my friends. We were talking about a bunch of different topics outside of our area of expertise. And I said, how do you guys know so much about things we didn't go to school for or whatever? And they mentioned that they listen to podcasts. So I started really digging into podcasts. I enjoyed it. And like many people, many tech-oriented people, I guess, back in 2010, I listened to a bunch of podcasts and then thought, I should do this. So I started my first podcast about 18 months later.
What was that podcast about?
It was called the TIL podcast. So TIL, for some of our younger listeners, means Today I Learned. It has been replaced by I was today years old when I learned this. And it was me and a bunch of friends talking about things that we didn't really know anything about, but talked about it anyway. Very, very typical early 2010s podcast. I think it was just like, we'll talk about Bitcoin. What does that mean? It was not a very popular podcast. It was like 5 people. It was a panel show, and I'm a bad moderator. But I learned the technical details of podcasting from that experience.
And so where has that taken you to today in terms of podcasts that you host or produce or work on? Like what's your podcasting resume looking like these days outside of the podcastworkflows.com?
Yeah, so I really did enjoy that experience, and I'm an extrovert, and I was working at home and I was moving away. So I started a proper podcast in 2016. It was called How I Built It. Today it's called Streamline Solopreneur. I finally decided to cede the name to How I Built This, which launched about 3 months after me. Yeah, I know. It was rough and I was sad. But I interviewed developers on that show. And so I would always say, like, so how did you build it? And so I didn't want to let go of the name. Today, I talk to busy solopreneur parents on the Streamline Solopreneur about how they can optimize their business and their time so they can spend more time with their family. On the more niched side of that, I have Podcast Workflows, which also has a podcast where I basically do the same thing through the lens of podcasting. So as you probably know, podcasting is a very time-consuming thing, or can be. And so I try to save podcasters time where I can. And so, so I have 2 other podcasts, but those are the 2 main ones that I'm really focused on.
I have to imagine that when you were first starting to do How I Built It and, progress through this journey, the tools for podcasting were not nearly as robust or as time-saving as they are today. But what were some of those early systems that you had before we can get into some of the more, like I said, robust platforms that are available to podcasters today?
Yeah, so I mean, scheduling tools might have existed, but they weren't as, let's say, ubiquitous as they are today. And so did everything via email. I had because I was a web developer in a former life. And so I had like a GitHub page that I would send to the other developers that I interviewed with, and how to record on your own, because we would talk via Skype. And I would use Skype call recorder, or Ecamm call recorder, rather. Pour one out for Ecamm call recorder. And then I would record my audio in QuickTime, and I would ask my guests to do the same thing. So sending instructions on how to do that and talking them through that, talking about the importance of headphones, which I still maintain is extremely important. But, in the before time, there was no way to do echo cancellation, really. So I didn't record video at that time. And it was a really largely manual process. So the time saving stuff came really on the other side of that, where I would build automations with Zapier or Airtable to do the communication side of things. And then because I was in web development, I wrote my own code on my WordPress website to do some of the emailing and publishing stuff.
Gotcha. All right. So outside of the stuff that you created for yourself, what are some of the tools today that you think are, especially for, like you said, that solopreneur, that podcaster working on his own? What are some of those tools that they have to really expedite and turn their podcast systems into something way more efficient and sustainable?
Yeah, so something that like a very conscious decision I made when I moved out of the web development space and fully into the podcasting space was I'm only going to use no code tools. Like if I'm going to be helping my audience who is non-technical, maybe, um, I'm not going to also write code that I have to like explain to them how to install and support, right? So today I'm using make.com, formerly Integromat. Make is very similar to Zapier. I would say Zapier is more user friendly. And so like I'm working on an automations course, and Zapier is going to kind of be the thing I focus on there because it is a more user friendly tool. Outside of that, I think Notion is where like my home base is, my whole dashboard for the show. And again, I was using Airtable, and I love Airtable, and I think the automations in Airtable are better. But Notion is a more popular, I think, largely more user friendly tool for a lot of people, especially if you're, with Airtable. Like I had all of the um, information about the podcast episode, but like you can't take show notes. There's not good formatting in Airtable for like long form text, right? Where there is in Notion. So I think if we're trying to streamline the tools that we're using, I think you can kill more birds with one stone with like Notion and Zapier than with like Notion, Airtable, and maybe like Google Docs or something like that. So those two are really at the center of a lot of things I do. And then, of course, there's Dropbox, and I'm using cal.com for scheduling, but Calendly is the most popular one there. I tend to like cal.com better because it is free if you're not using it for Teams, and it plays more nicely with make.com than Calendly does. So there are a few reasons why I made the switch over there, but um, between those things, you can really have like a well-oiled machine where once I record a podcast episode and do like the intro, I move it into a Dropbox folder called needs editing, and I don't see it again um, until it's live.
Wow. I mean, I'm familiar with Notion, and I guess the notion of Notion, I should say. But I know it's just so powerful, and that it could be a little daunting to get into it and really make it work for you. Whereas Airtable is basically just a glorified spreadsheet system, and Excel on steroids, as they might say. I know Notion could do some really amazing things, and that's one I definitely want to look into. I imagine too that the emergence of AI has been a major game changer for automation and podcast workflows that you are creating for people.
Yeah, so I'll tell people I'm AI hesitant because I think people want to use AI to do the wrong kind of work. It's like, oh, AI can come up with questions for my guests for me, or AI can make the outline for my episode. And I'm like, no, that's the thing that you're supposed to do. AI can certainly help you do some research on your guest or a topic, right? I like using AI to get other perspectives on a topic, maybe surface something I didn't think about that AI has learned that maybe this is worth exploring. On the other side of things, like, yes, I do use like AI tools to read the transcript and come up with descriptions or whatever, I've never been impressed with those. And so I will usually just use them as like a jumping off point, or like oh, that's I forgot about that and I didn't write it down in my notes. So like one of my custom prompts is here's a transcript from an episode of the Streamline Solopreneur. It's been quote unquote trained on what the Streamline Solopreneur is and what it's about and the target audience. The topic of the episode is then whatever the topic is. Please give me 3 to 6 takeaways from the episode. And usually at least one of those takeaways will be one I hadn't thought about that I think is worth highlighting. So like stuff like that, where it's like, I take notes during my interviews, but I definitely don't catch everything because I'm trying to actively listen or whatever, especially now that I'm like recording video too. Like it's just like a very bad look for me to be doing this while my guest is talking. And I still do it because I'm trying to take notes or like look up my stuff on my document. But if I can reduce the number of times I'm doing that, right, I think it's probably okay.
It's funny you're saying that because as you're talking, I am actually taking notes and looking up documents and whatnot. So 100% guilty.
Yeah. And like same still, right? Like I know, but like if it's like, if I can get to a point, because like I like our interview right now, like my interviews are on my Elgato prompter so that I can make eye contact when I'm talking. But as a result, it's like super obvious when I'm not looking at the camera anymore. And so like I get it, right? And I do it, but if AI can help me in those areas, I think it's good.
Yeah, that's something we've always stressed to with folks about AI tools, is that they are phenomenal. They are very helpful, but they don't replace the human. Like for me, when it comes to show notes, a blank piece of paper is just, threatening. It is intimidating, right? It's like, scarier than public speaking, the way people treat that kind of stuff. But once AI generates that first draft, it's a lot easier for me to look at it and be like, okay, let me tweak this. Let me edit this. Let me move this around. Oh, now this reminds me, I want to add this. And so AI is definitely a great supplement to your workflow, but we're just not at a place where it could replace human content where we need it.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And it's so funny you mentioned the blank, like the blank screen, right? Because I wrote about that in my newsletter this week as we record this. Where I talked about like when I was writing my master's thesis, like just looking at the blinking cursor in Word was so daunting. And I tell that story because I'm like, with segments, like if you do segments for a solo episode, you're not staring at a blank cursor anymore, right? Like you have kind of the broad strokes of what you want to talk about, and just like a little jumping off point will make that content creation process easier. And like having segments means that you don't feel like you need to fill the space with one thing for 10 minutes. And so it's really funny you mentioned that, because I agree wholeheartedly. Like just having a little prompt, no pun intended, I guess, to help you get to where you need to go is super helpful.
What about hardware? What are some of the tools that you use for video and audio that give you what is a extremely crisp picture, great sounding audio that you typically recommend to podcasters?
Great question. So my setup is, again, like I put it together pre 2020, we'll say, right before I think a lot of companies started investing in making affordable, really good podcasting stuff. And so like I'm using the Shure SM7B. I would not recommend that today for podcasters. The Shure MV7 is half the price, and I suspect just as good, or at least good, and then not appreciably worse than the SM7B, we'll say. And then I am using the Rodecaster Pro 2, which is like a pre-2020 item. And I just really like that because I do have multiple mics and different inputs, and it looks cool on my desk probably. And when I do solo shows, like I have, buttons assigned. And so I do like having that. I think the main reason that I have this kind of setup, right, I also don't need the cloud lifter, which is like another piece of hardware that you would need if you have the Shure SM7B. But the Rodecaster Pro supports that and then has like presets for the SM7B. The reason I have that is because right when we started recording Mathew, I don't know if you heard, but my daughter like fell or something and was screaming.
Oh no.
Yeah, and she was upstairs. My wife is up there. I didn't she didn't just like leave her for her own. But you know, she like ran into something and was just very upset. Um, and that's going to happen frequently in my house at various times of the day because I work from home and I have 3 small children. And one of the benefits of my setup is that no one ever hears that, which I really is good for a lot of reasons, right? So I would say like what I would recommend to most people today is if you can spend $250 on a mic, the Shure MV7 Plus is the way to go. If you are maybe sub 100, I would say like the Samsung Q2U or the ATR 2100X is going to be good, and those are good like USB microphones. Shure MV7 Plus is a USB-C, but it also supports XLR. So if you want a little bit of extra hardware processing, then you can also get like the Focusrite Scarlett Solo interface or something like that, but that's not really necessary anymore. And then for the camera, I will recommend that if you have if you're not looking to spend like $1,000 and you have an iPhone, that's the way to go. Because you get just like an incredible picture. And if you have a Mac, that's like there's continuity camera there. I have the Sony A6400 with a Sigma f16 lens, which is how we get like, this is not a zoom or blurring effect thing. This is like, there's the
Actual
bokeh
depth.
actual depth of field we're getting here. Yeah. More important than that, I think is the lighting, right? So like you need like a couple of good lights, because then no matter what camera you have, it's not working as hard to produce a crisp picture. So I have my key light right in front of me. I have the fill light over here, and then I have the backlight behind me, which is also helping create that depth. And then as an added bonus, I make sure that my monitor is on dark mode when I'm recording on camera, because the good lighting plus dark mode means that it's not. I noticed sometimes if I was demoing something for my YouTube channel, if I switched to a predominantly white background, the color in the video changed completely. Which is not something I'm sure a lot of people have to or need to think about, but it's something that I consider as well.
Yeah, I can definitely say I'm guilty of being in video calls and looking up at my camera and realizing that as I'm scrolling websites or whatever, maybe not paying attention, my lighting is changing on me, which is probably a dead giveaway that I'm not really listening. And you can see all the activity just from the lighting changes. Um, that iPhone continuity camera is a phenomenal hack for podcasters, especially if you're getting started. You don't want to spend more money on more equipment. It is free if you have a iOS device and a Mac OS operating system. It just works so well together. The one thing I found with it though is that it was so annoying to have to mount my phone to record and then have to remember to take it down, or maybe there was like something that I wanted to do on my phone at the same time that I was doing it. And so I actually reverted back to using a Logitech Brio, just so I can keep my phone handy for other things. But I agree wholeheartedly. If you don't have a good camera and you want to get started with high quality video, that the iPhone continuity camera is a great way to go. So if somebody is hearing this and they're thinking, okay, Joe, this sounds great. These automations, these workflows, how does somebody engage with you? How do you help a podcaster streamline their operation?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we get into the nitty gritty, first of all, I know I just listed a bunch of resources. If you go to podcastworkflows.com/tech, that's a page that I'll create specifically for your listeners, Mathew, with some of the stuff that we talked about here, the gear and the automations and like my free automation database. But the way that I help podcasters primarily is we'll sit down and first we'll talk about what their biggest problem is, right? A lot of podcasters will say like, I want to grow, I want to make money. And like, no matter what, you need time to do that, where a lot of podcasters will get stuck in the, all of my time is going to like actually creating the content. And so I want to help podcasters free up their time so that they can do the things they want to do most while also focusing on creating good content. That's how you get more listeners, right? It's not the only thing you have to do, but if you don't have good content, you're not going to keep people, right? So I will sit down with a podcaster and I'll ask them. I have a fairly long survey that we'll go through in like a discovery call where we cover every aspect of their show. So I'll usually say like, what do you do? Tell me everything you do for your show. And they'll say, all right, well, I look for guests and then I'll book with guests. And I'll be like, wait. How do you look for guests? Where do you look for them? How do you reach out to them? How much time do you spend doing that? Okay, then I'll book the guest. And then, no, wait. How do you book with the guest though? Do you use email or do you use like Calendly? And what do you ask them ahead of time? Then I record with the guest. Once we record, wait, where do you record? Right. So like, I want to get into the fine details of what they're doing, how they're doing it, what tools they're using. Because once I understand that, I can take all of those ingredients and bake them a beautiful save 12 hours per week cake with the tools that they use, right? Because that's the other thing I try to think about is like, you mentioned that you don't really like Notion or you haven't really looked into Notion, you prefer Airtable. If I come to you and I'm like, well, you have to use my Notion planner, that might immediately dissuade you from saving time. Whereas if I'm like, I can build this system inside of Airtable for you, that's going to be better for you, right? And if someone's like, I don't have any opinion, then I'm like, okay, well, great. Here's my Notion template and it's packaged and it's everything you need. But if you have tools that you prefer to use, I like to also use those tools because it creates less friction. Less friction creates more change, creates more time.
Yeah. And just, we actually don't use Airtable. I tried it once years ago and I found it to be limited. We're now with ClickUp, which also probably still not as robust as Notion in certain ways, but does have incredible automation capabilities and can be very useful. So if anybody ever has questions about ClickUp, please, don't hesitate to reach out. I can easily talk about, what's so great about that. So once again, if you are hearing this and you're thinking, I could really use some help to streamline my workflow, you're going to check out podcastworkflows.com. Again, it's podcastworkflows.com. Chatting with Joe Casabona. He's the podcast systems coach at podcastworkflows.com. So Joe, I mean, it sounds like you're already kind of doing this, but is there a place within the podcasting world where you'd like to see some improvement that maybe nobody's really working on today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the reasons that I'm really all in on this is because I've tried the positioning of grow your podcast, right? And I'm not a marketing guy. So I'm maybe not I grew a podcast very quickly, but that was a few years ago now, right? And things have changed. I've tried the make money with your podcast, which I can definitely still do. But a lot of people are doing that now, right? And I think that when it comes to thinking about workflows or processes, I think there's a lot of room for growth there, right? I think we're really early days into the AI, and like I'm not anti AI. Like I said, right? I am hesitant, and I want it to be used for the right things. So I think a place where I would love to see improvement is how can I leverage AI to take things off of my plate without replacing me in the content process? Because it's not going to be a replacement, right? It's going to be a worse experience or worse output, right? I would never if you're if you're hired as a speechwriter for the president of a company or of the United States or whatever, you're not going to have your intern write that speech. The speech is too important for someone who doesn't have as much experience, right, as you. So I view the same thing with AI. I view AI as an intern, not as my equal. And I think that when we can think about that more in the podcasting space, it will help us a lot more.
That's an interesting way to think about it. Now, if only the AI could get coffee for us while we're actually podcasting.
I know that. Well, that would just be swell.
I saw an amazing quote one time. It said something to the effect of, "I'd much rather have AI figure out like how to do my laundry, how to, how to take on these mundane tasks versus be used to replace or create art." Right? Like I'd rather have more time to do that than let AI take over that and have more time for the mundane stuff in the world. So that's I like the way you think about it with that intern perspective, right? It's not quite the pro, not quite the master. It's helpful, but right, it's not going to take over the master's job just yet. And I mean, I know you said you've had your tech around since 2010, but is there any since 2020, is there any technology that you are looking to get your hands on for podcasting, whether it's something that's out there that's just on your wish list, or maybe a piece of equipment or software that you wish somebody would make to streamline podcasting for you?
Wow, that's a really good question. I was talking to my friend Luis, and we were talking about like automating to the nth degree, just like how much could you do it? And what I would love, and I think this is within reach, but when I record solo episodes, I don't send them off to my editor. I use Ecamm Live, and I have a Stream Deck until like I can pause and easily remove stuff if I need to. But usually because of the segments, I don't have to cut out a lot of stuff. I still need to process because like I do take like heavy breaths, and I have like some mouth clicking, and I hate those sounds. And people will say like, yeah, but like you make those sounds in real life. And I say that's true, but I'm not doing it like right in someone's ear. Yeah.
Just so you people can enjoy exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah,
you don't
exactly.
hear them from Joe right now.
Right. Yeah. I'm usually like feet away from people when that's happening. Right. And not like right up in their ear. So I want to remove that stuff. And I have like this little chain in Logic Pro. And what I would love is like, as soon as I save a file to a specific folder, it opens up in Logic Pro, runs those filters, and spits out the finalized file. And I think you can do that with like Apple Script, maybe. But it's that is one place that I would love to see, because that would take so much little manual, like fewer manual clicks off of my plate. And like, I know that people will say like, well, there's studio sound in Descript. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not, my chain is dialed into my microphone and the way I talk. And I want that editing, because that's going to sound a lot better than AI trying to figure out. Also, I don't know if they fix this, but like studio sound is god awful when you use an actual good mic. Like AI is maybe they fix this, but studio sound is for the people using the built-in microphone with no headphones. It does an amazing job of cleaning that up, but like because it makes these assumptions, if those don't exist in the audio, it just kind of like fakes it.
Yeah, it can overwork good audio. I haven't used it in a couple of years, but it has done miracles for bad audio. But yeah, I'm a little hesitant to use it on decent audio.
Right, because the directive isn't clean up this audio if it needs to be cleaned up. It's clean up this audio.
Right. Remove the room noise. Well, there's no room noise, so I'm going to remove something.
Yeah, exactly.
You might even like that. Okay. And then the last question we like to ask everybody is there a podcast that you are subscribed to or that you are listening to that, maybe you have a bunch in your playlist, but when this one hits, you're going to stop what you're doing. You're going to listen to it, right? You never miss an episode. What's that podcast or two that just will always have priority for you?
One is Cortex from Relay or Relay.fm. That's with CGP Grey and Mike Hurley. It's monthly, And it's just a great, I love the insight that they give on like productivity and the way they think about work. And it's just a very interesting podcast to me. And then the other one is Serious Trouble, and that's with Josh Barrow, a journalist who formerly hosted KCRW's Left, Right, and Center, and Ken White, a former federal prosecutor, and they talk about federal cases. And I think that Josh is an excellent, like, you know which side of the aisle he falls on politically, but he's an excellent journalist who asks really good questions. And I think Ken White is just a very funny commentator. And so you also know where he falls, and he's a little bit more partisan than Josh, but I think his insights and experience are very funny. And so I love listening to that podcast.
All right. Very good. Well, we'll have links to those two shows as well in the show notes, as well as a link to podcastworkflows.com and some profiles if you want to check out Joe Casabona, the podcast systems coach at Podcast Workflows. Joe, it is a pleasure to chat with you. And now that I know that you're just a few miles away, I hope we get to meet up in person soon. Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, and absolutely anytime, Mathew. Thanks so much for having me on the show.